Dobro večer. Natanko teden dni po ameriških volitvah bomo v Globusu govorili o pričakovanjih in razočaranjih preteklih 4 in prihodnjih 4 let v Beli hiši. O tem, zakaj liberalni kapitalizem izgublja ugled in kakšne so alternative. O tem, zakaj gibanja okupirajmo, ki lahko spremenijo svet, saj kot pravi je najbolj pomembna lekcija zgodovine ta, da pravice nikoli niso dodeljene, ampak so pridobljene. Originalnost njegovih idej je sprožila tako imenovano revolucijo Chomsky, paradigmo, ki so jo bili deležni le največji svetovni misleci, kot so Descartes, Darwin, Einstein, Freud. S profesorjem Chomskym se bom tukaj na Inštitutu za tehnologijo v Bostonu v Massachusettsu pogovarjala tik pred ameriškimi volitvami. So, Mr. Chomsky, thank you for talking to us. Can you tell us what American society looks like after 4 years under President Obama?
It hasn't changed very much. Obama's major problem when he came into office was the economic crash, of course. And so he naturally had to pick an economic team. And it was very instructive to see who he picked. He picked people who essentially were responsible for the crash. So he picked what are called the Rubin boys, the Rubin's associates, Geithner, Summers, and others. These are the people who were involved in the deregulation catastrophe, which was a large factor in the crash, and a failure to attend to the huge housing bubble, which was beyond any fundamentals and was obviously going to crash. But they didn't pay any attention to it on the grounds that of a religious doctrine. Markets know best, so it must be okay. He also explicitly avoided any of the critics, even Nobel laureates. And that was indicated pretty clearly where the administration was going. That was quite predictable. If you take a look at the core of Obama's campaign funding, it came substantially from financial institutions. That's been shown over the years pretty persuasively, I think, that you can have a very fair, reasonably good prediction of the policies of administration simply by looking at the distribution of campaign funding. These are the people who pay to get the president in office, and they're going to be paid back. And in fact, that's what happened.
Was Mr. Obama a victim of too greater expectations? And what can we expect for the next 4 years? Presumably, he's going to win the elections.
Obama had a talent for spinning illusions. So in that sense, yes, he was a victim of failed expectations. But there was no reason to accept the illusions. I mean, that's what politicians do. He happens to be quite good at it.
All through your books, there is a feeling that United States of America are the only obstacle between the world and the peace in the world. That sounds somewhat Americocentric.
I don't think I've ever suggested that. There's plenty of, take the worst war that's going on, the Eastern Congo, by far the worst. Maybe 5 million people killed in the past few years. The United States, well, of course, has some kind of a peripheral role in it, but it's not the leading factor. And there's plenty of other examples. But the United States has an outsized role. It's by far the richest and most powerful country in the world. Just taking a look only at the military dimension, its military expenditures are almost as much as the rest of the world combined, technologically far more advanced. It's the only country that has the world saturated with military bases, maybe 1,000 roughly. It's in arms sales, global arms sales, it's far in the lead, about 3/4 of total global arms sales. It's 10 times as high as the second, Russia. And you go on like this, of course, its role is overwhelming. It's the only country that has military forces carrying out and involved in aggression, actually, in many parts of the world. Obama has instituted a global assassination campaign, which is something quite new and quite extreme, and it's going to get more so. They've just announced new plans to construct what they call a disposition matrix, which is going to be a huge information center, which will also include surveillance of Americans, but will identify individuals who their intelligence suggests may ultimately want to harm the United States and therefore target them for assassination. So of course it's got a major role, and there are other things too. I mean, take for example what's regarded in the United States and much of the West as the greatest threat to world peace, namely Iranian nuclear policies. You could argue about how great a threat that is and why it's considered a threat, but just look at it. Let's assume it's a threat. And there is a pretty straightforward way to address it. Very straightforward. Work to establish a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. There's overwhelming international support for that. The United States insists that Israel has to be excluded. Okay, that's a non-starter. It's the major nuclear power in the region. If you exclude Israel, you can't have a nuclear weapons-free zone. And Israel's already made it pretty clear they're not even going to attend. So yes, and there's a very striking case where the U.S. is standing in the way of, if not world peace, at least a way to overcome what they themselves consider to be the major threat to peace. That's not the only example.
So you have been a fierce critic of neoliberalism all through your books, through your career. And you have been informing people about it, writing about it. Do you feel somehow frustrated that the world is going down the same path even faster?
I don't think that's happening. So much of the world is extricating themselves from the neoliberal disaster, which is what it was. Latin America was one of the most loyal followers of the neoliberal programs, and it had a couple of decades of a serious decline. But about 10 years ago, it started to pull out. The South America in particular began for the first time in 500 years, actually, to extricate itself from the system of Western domination. At first Europe, then more recent years the United States. And it's gone quite far. And that's, to a substantial extent, an uprising against neoliberalism. So they pretty much throughout the IMF, they've turned to more kind of social democratic programs, the kind that the neoliberal consensus tried to ban. The Arab Spring was also in substantial part an uprising against neoliberalism. Now, it hasn't ended it, but that was a large part of the motivating force of in Tunisia, in Egypt, and elsewhere. The neoliberal programs had been employed and very highly praised by the World Bank and the IMF. Egypt, in particular, was considered a model of probity, doing just the right things. But for most of the population, it was a disaster. It had the usual impact that it has everywhere, even in the United States. There's growth and wealth, but it goes into very few pockets. For the majority of the population, it's stagnation or decline. The support systems that help people survive are eliminated. And of course it engenders massive corruption, which is then described as a distortion of neoliberalism, but it isn't. It's endemic to it. The same thing is happening in the United States. That's essentially, it's a rich country, so it's a very different phenomenon, but structurally it's rather similar. So since the neoliberal programs were instituted, roughly Reagan and Thatcher, there's been growth, very high concentration of wealth for the majority of the population, stagnation, decline. The benefit system, which was never very substantial by European standards, has declined further. And the kinds of agitation and uprisings that you see today are whether they're focused carefully or not, are in large measure opposition to this. Part of it has been the enormous enrichment of the big banks and the investment firms. In fact, it's become what the head of the British banking system called a doom cycle. You can see it with the major banks, like take, say, Citigroup, huge bank, a huge conglomerate. It's been since it got its first major bailout in the early 1980s. It was practically going bankrupt, but the Reagan administration worked out ways for it to be paid off. Since then, it's been engaged in a cycle of risky transactions, which are highly profitable because they're risky, but then they collapse, and then it's followed by a government bailout. So there's what amounts to a government insurance policy. It's called too big to fail, not just Citigroup, but others. And it's estimated at being roughly in the $50 billion a year range, just an insurance policy for the big banks, which encourages them to proceed further in the doom cycle. That's a characteristic neoliberal program. And there are many others. So it's not just me who's criticizing it. It's being criticized and opposed in various ways all over the world, and rightly. It's a very harmful set of programs for the vast majority.
Okay, so you were mentioning Latin America, but what about Europe? In an interview for TV Slovenia 8 years ago, you told me that the United States of America are very eager for the Eastern European states to join the European Union in order to dismantle their social welfare system.
Which is exactly what's happening.
That's what I'm asking.
In fact, Mario Draghi, the head of the ECB, European Central Bank, recently informed the Wall Street Journal in an interview that the European social contract is dead. That's the effect of the policies that they're pursuing, whether by design or not, you could argue, but it's a clear effect. If you impose austerity in a period of recession, it's going to undermine growth, it's going to dismantle social welfare systems, it's going to increase debt, which is exactly what it's doing. And there's no even the IMF has come out pretty harshly critical of it. But the policies are being pursued, and they're by no means necessary. There's alternatives. And one consequence is indeed to dismantle the social democratic system, which was one of Europe's great contributions to civilization in the post-war period. Not in the North, incidentally. This is being done mostly in the southern countries, the ones that are kind of more like the third world in some ways.
Well, Timothy Garton actually even applied that United States of America are going to be more socialist in the near future than Europe. Do you see that coming?
Well, it's kind of interesting to compare them right now. So Europe and the United States, like every region, have a central bank. In the United States, it's the Federal Reserve. In Europe, it's the ECB. By comparative standards, the Federal Reserve is more progressive. So even in legislation, the Federal Reserve has two missions by virtue of the legislation that establishes it. One is to keep a lid on inflation, and the other commitment is to maintain high employment. The ECB only has one commitment, to rein in inflation. In fact, they have a target, can't be above 2%, that's basically imposed by the Bundesbank, which prevents growth, which is creating the divisions it's a factor creating the divisions we're now seeing and undermining the economies of the weaker countries and even harming the others. So in that respect, and the Federal Reserve has undertaken actions to, I don't think they're enough, but some actions to try to mitigate the worst effects of the crisis. The European Troika, has instituted measures which are making it worse.
How can that be fought against? So we accept liberal democratic capitalism and fight for the breadcrumbs like minority rights, gay rights, paid lunch at work. But we are not questioning the frame. Should the society, should the people be challenging the whole frame of it all?
Sure. For one thing, we should be asking whether indeed it's liberal democratic capitalism. Actually, it's not. What's called capitalism is a highly protectionist system with massive state intervention in the economy. And in recent years, it's been designed to benefit the rich. But it's not just take a look at the World Trade Organization. It sets the basic rules for the international economy. It has some liberal elements, but not much. It's aimed at tariff reduction, but tariffs are already very low, like in North America, practically non-existent. So that's kind of a marginal part. It also has very extreme protectionist elements. For example, it instituted the most extreme patent system that has ever existed. It's called intellectual property rights. Grants enormous profits to pharmaceutical corporations and software companies and so on. If a regime like that had been in place, England and the United States would never have developed. And if you look at the development of U.S. industry, massive government intervention all along, starting with mass production in the 19th century right up till today. If you use a computer or the internet, you're using the products of decades of development in the state sector right here, in fact, where we're sitting, before it was handed over to private corporations for adaptation to commercial products and marketing. And that's true all through the system. So in the first place, it's not a democratic liberal system. It's a mixed system designed, not surprisingly, for the benefit of the designers.
That's what I wanted to ask you. We are convinced that democracy and capitalism go hand in hand, but is the current crisis eating up the democratic values? What's happening?
It's a little hard to discuss because we don't really have capitalism. And democracy is a kind of a funny notion. So take the United States, which is, the earliest modern democratic society, in many ways, the peak of the democratic system. So just take the United States. The political science profession, a large part of it is devoted to a very important topic, and they do it quite well, namely the study of public attitudes and public policy and the correlation between them. That's a measure of democracy. So what do they discover? Well, the most recent authoritative work finds that about 70% of the population have no influence on policy whatsoever. So they're effectively disenfranchised. As you move up the income level, influence increases slowly, but when you get to the very top, they get what they want. Is that democracy? You're allowed to vote without anybody shooting you, but for most of the population is effectively disenfranchised, and it's basically run by the wealthy. And that's the way elections are run. Elections are, of course, there's plenty of propaganda about it, but the advertising agencies, which I mentioned before, understand what's happening. They're the ones who run the elections. The elections are run by the public relations industry. Take a look at television ads. They're the ones who produce them. What is the public relations industry? Well, its main commitment is commercial advertising. So what's commercial advertising? Well, anyone who's looked at a television ad knows exactly what it is. It's a massive effort to undermine markets. If you took a course in college in economics, you learn that markets are based on informed consumers making rational choices. You take a look at a television ad and you see right away it's designed to create uninformed consumers making irrational choices, so to undermine markets. And that's hundreds of billions of dollars are spent a year to undermine markets that way. Well, when the same institutions take over marketing candidates, they do the same thing. They want to create an uninformed electorate which will make irrational choices, hence to undermine democracy. And that's quite natural. That's in the interests of who exactly they are. They're just big state capitalist institutions. Of course they do this.
The corporate attack on education is what we are witnessing at the moment. And with dismantling the welfare system in Europe, universities are getting less and less money. It's more and more difficult to study and to educate the people. So students are demanding more rights, more money for education, and it's just not happening. How do you see that?
Part of the dismantling of the social contract. I mean, mass education, which was actually pioneered in the United States was way ahead of Europe in this, that's of benefit to the general population. I mean, it also happens to be of benefit to the economy, but it's a great benefit to the people. I mean, take even post-war United States. After the Second World War, it was basically free higher education. Costs were nominal, even in the Ivy League institutions. And the GI Bill provided free education to a huge part of the population, which would never have been able to go to college before. That's, of course, very good for the people. And it was also a major factor in leading to the great growth rate of the period. Well, since the 1970s, that's being dismantled. And the reason is it benefits people. It doesn't benefit the very rich. And therefore, who wants it? Who needs it?
In Europe, we still have that in most part of Europe because the crisis, apparently due to the crisis, universities are going to get less money. What would that mean for Slovenian society, for example?
Same as it does here. If you deprive the large mass of the population of decent educational opportunities, they'll be harmed. And of course, the economy will be harmed. But the very rich will do fine.
So what should the role of intellectuals be at this stage? Walter Benjamin said that the leftist thinkers shouldn't be riding the train of history but apply the brake. How can the brakes be applied at the current situation?
Well, I actually think we have to press the accelerator. If you read the business press, what they say is this is the time to press the accelerator, meaning stimulate the economy. Use the ample resources to do so, both in Europe and the United States, and you press the brake later if there's ever any long-term problem of inflation, which you don't see. And that's the image they use. Press the accelerator, wait with the brake. What intellectuals should be doing is supporting the conservative business press on this issue, but they should also be pointing out what the sources of the problem are and helping people understand and organize to get to the roots of the problem. The great mass of intellectuals are supportive of power and its agents, in fact. And the fringe of dissidents should be involved in social movements.
8 years ago for TV Slovenia, you also said that the globalized movement will start occurring and that they will be able to change things. Are the Occupy movements the movements that can actually change things, bring new things into the society?
The Occupy movement, say, in the United States, it's a year old. It's a very recent movement. And it's been quite successful. It's changed the nature of the discourse in the society very substantially. It's come out with important programs. It's brought people together, which is a very significant thing in a country like this. I happen to live in a suburb. When I moved in, it was kind of middle class, rural, in fact. Now it's very rich. Land prices have gone up, mansions everywhere. The taxpayers have plenty of money, but they are so sociopathic, so incapable of acting together in the common interest that every time there's a storm, everybody loses power. It would take almost nothing to put the power lines underground, but that would have to be a common effort in which you work together to help each other. And the very rich live with an ideology which says you don't do anything for anyone else, you only do it for yourself. So they suffer. And it's the same just driving to work. People spend hours commuting. If they agreed to allow the subway to go to the suburbs, they get to work in 10 minutes. But they refuse. This is sociopathic behavior, which is very harmful, even to the people involved, but they can't get out of it. It's an ideology which is overwhelming. And the Occupy movement began to break it. I mean, one of the important things it did is just bring people together to do something for a common cause, you know, common soup kitchen, health services, a place to talk about things and so on. And that's the beginnings of what has to be done. But, you know, major movements don't get anywhere in a year.
Are Occupy movements the start of this? Are they organized enough?
You never know. I mean, 50 years ago, a few black students sat in a lunch counter in North Carolina, Greensboro, North Carolina, and they were immediately arrested and hauled off to jail and so on. And nobody could know whether that's the end or whether it's the beginning. Turned out to be the beginning. Turned out more students came. Pretty soon you had Freedom Riders, and an organization was formed, SNCC, and pretty soon you got some reasonably decent legislation. The civil rights movement went on, but it moved on to class issues, to issues of poverty and repression. At that point, the lid came down. The northern liberals were not going to have any of that. It's okay to criticize racist Alabama sheriffs, but not us, please. So as soon as Martin Luther King moved to housing issues, poverty issues, and so on, he was essentially destroyed. That's what happens when you move to the serious issues.
So you offered many explanations during the half an hour we had, but could you offer us a quick insight into the future as well? Would you?
Nobody's ever been able to do that. Prediction is a very low probability activity. I mean, take all the things we've been talking about. None of them could have been predicted.
But you have predicted that a global movement is going to happen. You've predicted that 8 years ago, and you predicted about the Eastern European states dismantling the European Union.
Well, that was just a description of what's happening. In fact, what I was saying about the East European states, you could read in the business press. I mean, the business press was euphoric when the Berlin Wall fell. The Financial Times, Business Week, and they were very explicit about it. They said this will be a way to undermine, I'm quoting now, the luxurious living standards of Western workers. Not that luxurious unless you're way up there. But this would be a way of bringing a mass of poorly paid workers who have the advantage that they're educated and healthy, because they were coming from a system, whatever you think about it, which had reasonable education and health standards. And furthermore, though nobody would say this, they're white and have blue eyes, which is an advantage. So that's a way of undermining Western workers, and of course dismantling the social contract.
Should we be afraid of the future?
Should we be afraid of it? No, depends. It's in our hands. There's a lot of things to be afraid of. So, for example, take, again, this storm yesterday. You can't identify the sources of a particular event, but there's an increasing frequency of severe weather catastrophes, and it's exactly what's predicted by the global warming models, and much else too, like the melting of the Arctic ice and so on. And that's really serious. I mean, that may doom decent society. And unfortunately, we're racing towards catastrophe. So if somebody was looking at us from Mars, they'd say, you know, they're a bunch of lunatics marching towards a cliff and happily singing about your achievement. Nuclear war is another problem. So there's a lot to be concerned about. I don't think any of it's out of hand, but and the same is true of, say, the austerity programs. I mean, take Europe. There's a huge number of young people who don't have any work. If you don't have any work, it's very destructive. You're not going to be able to get into the productive labor force later on. These people are being destroyed. You've got huge resources, huge number of people want to work, a lot of work that has to be done, and the society, the socioeconomic order is so pathological that it can't put them together. Well, that's not a law of nature. That can be changed.
Mr. Chomsky, thank you for talking to us.
Thanks.
Veliko tem se nam je zaradi pomanjkanja časa žal izmuznilo iz pogovora, pa bi jih bilo treba obdelati. Kljub temu pa vse povedano ponuja temelje za temeljit razmislek o sedanjosti in tudi o prihodnosti, ki se je skoraj bojimo. To je bil Globus, lahko noč.